What would you do if a trusted friend, the woman who stood beside you in church, sang hymns in harmony, and shared in your family's life, held a secret that would shatter everything you believed in? For Texas housewife Candy Montgomery, a moment of confrontation with Betty Gore unraveled her world, turning faith and friendship into betrayal and violence. What happened next left a community in shock and a family forever broken. Stay tuned as we uncover the dark secrets, devastating truths, and a crime that shook a quiet Texas suburb to its core. In Wiley, Texas, life seemed picture-perfect. Families sought the simplicity of suburban living, where neighbors greeted each other warmly, children played together, and the local Methodist Church of Lucas served as a hub for faith and fellowship. This was a community where appearances meant everything, and Candy Montgomery fit right in. Candy was a vivacious and outgoing woman, a devoted wife to Pat Montgomery, and a loving mother to their 2 children. Her days were filled with organizing church events, teaching Sunday school, and managing her family's home. Candy's energy and warmth made her a beloved member of the congregation, and many saw her as a cornerstone of their community. To those who knew her, Candy's life seemed blessed. A happy family, strong faith, and the admiration of her peers. Among Candy's acquaintances was Betty Gore, a middle school teacher, mother of 2, and fellow churchgoer. Betty's life appeared equally stable. She was married to Alan Gore, a reserved electrical engineer, and together they were raising their family with the same values the community cherished. Betty was known for her quieter nature and her dedication to both her family and her students. She wasn't as outgoing as Candy, but she was respected and well-liked in church circles. The 2 women's paths often crossed at church events and social gatherings. Their children played together, and they shared moments of camaraderie over their shared roles as mothers and active church members. To outsiders, Candy and Betty represented the best of suburban life: faith, family, and friendship. Beneath this veneer, however, lay unseen cracks that would lead to tragedy. Candy's restless energy, once an asset, began to mask a growing dissatisfaction with the monotony of her life. Meanwhile, Betty struggled with her own challenges, including feelings of isolation and insecurities in her marriage. These unspoken struggles, compounded by a shocking secret, would unravel both their lives and shake their community to its core. What seemed like an ordinary suburban connection between 2 women would soon reveal the hidden complexities of their lives and lead to an act of violence no one could have foreseen. Candy Montgomery's life, on the surface, appeared idyllic. She was a devoted wife, a loving mother, and an active member of the Methodist Church of Lucas. But beneath the surface of her carefully curated suburban existence, Candy felt a gnawing restlessness that she couldn't ignore. The predictability of her days, school runs, church functions, and endless domestic routines left her yearning for something more. She began to crave excitement, a break from the monotony that had slowly dulled the spark in her life. Candy often masked her dissatisfaction with a bright, cheerful demeanor that endeared her to friends and neighbors. She was the type of woman who could light up a room with her energy, a favorite among the church congregation, but inside she felt trapped by the expectations of her role. The endless demands of being a wife, mother, and community leader had left her feeling invisible. Pat, her husband, was steady and reliable, but emotionally distant, his attention often consumed by his demanding job. Conversations between them had grown perfunctory, and their once passionate marriage had settled into a comfortable but unremarkable routine. It was during this period of inner turmoil that Candy began to notice Alan Gore in a different light. Alan, the soft-spoken husband of Betty Gore, was familiar to Candy through their shared church activities and social gatherings. Unlike his reserved and often guarded wife, Alan seemed approachable, even warm in his quiet way. He wasn't flashy or particularly charismatic, but there was something steady and reassuring about him. Candy's gaze would linger on him during church services or community events, and she began to sense a connection, subtle but undeniable. Their interactions were initially casual, a few words exchanged during church socials or after choir practice. But as weeks passed, Candy found herself seeking out opportunities to speak with Alan. She noticed how he would smile politely, how his voice carried a gentle timbre that she found comforting. Candy began to wonder if Alan, too, felt the weight of suburban monotony, if he, like her, was searching for something to break the cycle. The first time Candy truly tested the waters was during a church picnic. She found herself sitting next to Alan under the shade of a large oak tree, the hum of conversation and children's laughter filling the air around them. They talked about inconsequential things at first, the weather, their children, church events. But as the conversation deepened, Candy felt a spark she hadn't felt in years. She laughed more freely, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that neither could ignore. Alan, for his part, seemed taken aback by Candy's charm and vivacity. It was a stark contrast to his interactions with Betty, which had grown strained and distant. As the days turned into weeks, Candy's thoughts became consumed by Alan. She began to imagine scenarios where she could speak with him alone, where they could share more of the easy connection they had discovered. Her heart would race whenever she saw him at church, and she found herself lingering in places where she knew he'd be. Alan, though reserved, wasn't oblivious to Candy's attention. He began to notice her more, the way her laughter seemed to linger just for him, the way her eyes seemed to light up when he was near. The turning point came one evening after choir practice. The church had emptied out, and Candy and Alan found themselves alone in the dimly lit sanctuary. It was quiet, the air heavy with unspoken tension. Candy took a breath and decided to take the leap. "Alan," she began, her voice soft but deliberate, "have you ever felt like something is missing?" Alan looked at her, startled by the question. I'm not sure what you mean," he replied cautiously. Candy hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I mean, don't you ever feel like there should be more to life? Like maybe we get so caught up in what we're supposed to do that we forget what we want?" Alan's brow furrowed, and he glanced down at his hands. "I guess I've thought about that," he admitted. "But it's hard to change things when so many people depend on you." Candy smiled, a faint, almost wistful expression. "Exactly. Sometimes it feels like we're just going through the motions." There was a long pause, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Then, with a boldness that surprised even herself, Candy said, "Alan, have you ever thought about having an affair?" Alan froze, his eyes widening in shock. "What?" Candy's gaze didn't waver. "I'm not talking about love or anything messy, just something for us. A way to feel alive again." Alan stammered, clearly taken aback. "Candy, I don't think that's a good idea." But Candy's persistence was unrelenting. Over the next few weeks, she continued to plant seeds of suggestion, subtly coaxing Alan into considering her proposal. She assured him it would be simple, that no one would ever know, that they could set boundaries to keep it from spiraling out of control. Alan, despite his initial resistance, found himself drawn to the idea. His marriage to Betty had been strained for years. Betty's struggles with postpartum depression and her reserved nature had created a chasm between them that he didn't know how to bridge. The thought of feeling desired, of escaping the tension at home, became increasingly tempting. And Candy's confidence, her vivacity, was difficult to resist. Eventually, Alan gave in. The two established strict rules to maintain control and avoid emotional entanglement. They agreed to meet only during the day, when their spouses were at work and their children at school. Motels in neighboring towns became their secret meeting places, and they carefully coordinated their schedules to avoid suspicion. It was a calculated arrangement, designed to bring excitement without risk. For a time, the affair provided the escape both of them sought. Candy felt a renewed sense of vitality, the thrill of the forbidden giving her life a spark it had long been missing. Alan found solace in the moments they shared, a reprieve from the frustrations of his home life. But as their secret meetings continued, the weight of their actions began to grow heavier. Alan, who had always been more reserved, started to feel the strain of their deception. He couldn't ignore the guilt that crept into his thoughts, especially when he was around Betty. Her intuition was sharp, and she began to notice subtle changes in him, the way he avoided her gaze, the way his touch felt distant. Betty's suspicions grew, though she couldn't quite pinpoint the cause. Candy, meanwhile, found herself growing frustrated, The strict rules they had set, which once felt liberating, now felt restrictive. She wanted more from Alan, but he remained hesitant to let their arrangement stray from its carefully constructed boundaries. The excitement she had initially felt began to fade, replaced by a growing dissatisfaction that mirrored the emptiness she had sought to escape. The tension between them reached a breaking point one afternoon during one of their secret meetings. Alan, his guilt finally too much to bear, told Candy it had to end. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "It's not fair to Betty. It's not fair to either of us." Candy tried to reason with him, to convince him that they could continue without consequence. But Alan was resolute. He knew that the longer they continued, the more likely it was that their secret would unravel. For Alan, the affair had become a source of more stress than solace, and he was determined to refocus on his marriage. The affair ended, but the consequences lingered. Candy was left grappling with the loss of the one thing that had made her feel alive, while Alan returned to a home filled with tension and unspoken truths. And for Betty, unaware of the betrayal that had taken place, a growing unease settled over her, a sense that something was deeply wrong in her marriage. The seeds of betrayal had been sown, and it was only a matter of time before they would bear their tragic and violent fruit. If you've made it this far into the story, type "picture" in the comments. Let's confuse everyone else who didn't. The morning of June 13th dawned quiet and unremarkable in Wiley, Texas. The Montgomery and Gore families were going about their daily routines, unaware of the tragedy that would soon unfold. Candy Montgomery, as part of her usual busy day, decided to stop by Betty Gore's house. On the surface, it was a simple visit, a friendly gesture to pick up a swimsuit for Betty's daughter. Beneath the veneer of routine friendliness, however, tensions were about to boil over. Candy pulled up to the modest Gore home and stepped out of her car, the summer heat already clinging to the air. She knocked on the door and Betty answered, her face tight and unreadable. Candy greeted her with her trademark warmth, but Betty's response was subdued, her eyes scanning Candy's face with an intensity that hinted at unspoken thoughts. Invited inside, Candy stepped into the house, where the air felt heavier than usual, the silence between them almost palpable. As Candy moved toward the living room, Betty's voice stopped her. "Candy, we need to talk." Candy turned, her cheerful expression faltering at the serious tone. Betty's posture was stiff, her hands clutching a corner of the table as if steadying herself. "Is there something wrong?" Candy asked, her voice light, though her chest tightened with unease. Betty's gaze didn't waver. "I know about the affair." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, freezing Candy in place. Her mind raced for a response, but Betty pressed on, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and pain. "How could you, after everything? You sat in my house, played with my children, and smiled at me, all while you—" Betty's voice broke, tears threatening to spill. Candy's initial shock gave way to defensive reasoning. "Betty, it wasn't like that. It didn't mean anything. It's over now, I swear." But Betty wasn't placated. Her voice rose, the anger she'd suppressed now bubbling over. "It didn't mean anything. You betrayed me. You betrayed my family." Candy tried to steady her own rising panic. "Betty, please. I never meant to hurt you. Alan and it was a mistake." "A mistake?" Betty's eyes flashed. "You call destroying my marriage a mistake?" The confrontation escalated quickly, both women's voices rising as years of unspoken tension and betrayal came to the surface. Candy pleaded for forgiveness, but Betty's rage was unrelenting. At some point, Betty turned and left the room, returning moments later with an axe in her hands. The sight of it sent a jolt of fear through Candy. Betty gripped the handle tightly, her knuckles white, and her expression was one of raw, unfiltered fury. "You're not leaving this house," Betty said, her voice low but steady. Candy's breath quickened. "Betty, put that down. We can talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about," Betty snapped. "You've ruined my life, Candy." What happened next unfolded in a blur of fear and chaos. Candy, desperate to defuse the situation, tried to grab the axe, but Betty refused to let go. The two women struggled. The small living room suddenly transformed into a battleground. Furniture was knocked askew, and the air filled with the sound of their labored breathing and the sharp clatter of the axe striking the floor. Candy, fueled by adrenaline and sheer survival instinct, managed to wrest the axe from Betty's grip. What followed was a brutal, frenzied attack that defied comprehension. Candy struck Betty once, then again and again, each blow more ferocious than the last. By the time she stopped, Betty lay lifeless on the floor, her body bearing 41 devastating wounds. The room was silent except for Candy's ragged breathing and the faint metallic tang of blood hanging in the air. Candy stood frozen, staring at what she had done. Her hands trembled, the axe slipping from her grip and landing with a dull thud on the blood-soaked carpet. In that moment, she was no longer the cheerful housewife, the beloved church member. She was something else entirely, someone she didn't recognize. The reality of her actions began to sink in. Candy knew she had to leave, to cover her tracks, to return to the life she had so violently disrupted. She cleaned herself up as best as she could, discarding any evidence of the struggle, and left the gore house as if nothing had happened. To the outside world, she was just Candy Montgomery, running errands on an ordinary day. But what had transpired inside that house was far from ordinary. As Candy returned to her own home, she tried to compartmentalize the horror of what had happened. She went about her evening as if it were any other, playing the role of devoted wife and mother. But the truth of that day couldn't stay hidden for long. The events of June 13th would soon come to light, revealing the dark undercurrents beneath Candy's seemingly perfect life, and leaving an entire community to grapple with the shocking violence that had unfolded in their midst. Alan Gore's day had started uneventfully, but as hours passed without a response from his wife, Betty, unease began to creep in. Alan had tried calling home multiple times, but the phone rang unanswered, an unusual occurrence for Betty, who was always attentive to their home. As his concern mounted, Alan reached out to their neighbors, asking if someone could check on her. His voice, though calm, betrayed a growing sense of worry. The neighbors, familiar with the Gores and their reliable routines, agreed to investigate. Arriving at the modest home, they knocked on the door but received no answer. A sense of foreboding settled over them as they decided to enter. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, the usual warmth and activity replaced by an unsettling stillness. As they moved through the house, their search led them to the utility room. What they found there would haunt them forever. Betty's lifeless body lay on the floor, the room splattered with blood, and the axe, a horrifying instrument of violence, resting nearby. The sheer brutality of the scene was incomprehensible. Betty had been struck 41 times, a level of violence that defied explanation. Shock and disbelief rippled through the group as they struggled to process what they were seeing. News of the discovery spread quickly through the tight-knit community. Wiley, a town that prided itself on its close bonds and wholesome image, was suddenly thrust into chaos. Betty Gore's murder shattered the sense of security that had long defined the town. Neighbors who had shared meals, worshipped together, and raised children side by side were now grappling with the realization that such a heinous act could occur in their midst. The stage was set for a story that would captivate the nation and uncover the dark secrets hidden beneath Wiley's serene surface. The investigation into Betty Gore's brutal murder began immediately after her body was discovered. The small town of Wiley was rocked by the shocking crime, and local police faced immense pressure to find answers. The crime scene told a gruesome story, blood spattered across the utility room, the axe lying nearby, and the sheer violence of the attack evident in Betty's injuries. Despite the chaos of the scene, there were no signs of forced entry, suggesting the killer was someone Betty knew. In the days following the murder, police interviewed friends, neighbors, and members of the church. Candy Montgomery, known for her friendly and cooperative nature, was questioned as part of the routine. At first, she showed no signs of nervousness, presenting herself as calm and helpful. She explained that she had stopped by Betty's house earlier in the day to pick up a swimsuit for Betty's daughter, but claimed nothing unusual had happened. Initially, Candy raised no suspicions, but inconsistencies in her story began to emerge. Forensic evidence from the crime scene pointed to a violent struggle, and investigators found fingerprints and traces of blood that didn't align with Betty's movements alone. As detectives dug deeper, Candy's composed demeanor began to crack under the weight of their questioning. After several interviews, Candy admitted that she had been present when Betty was killed. Her shocking confession came with a startling claim: self-defense. Candy alleged that Betty had confronted her about the affair and attacked her with the axe in a fit of rage. Candy claimed she had fought back in fear for her life, losing control during the violent struggle. The admission stunned investigators, while Candy's explanation provided a narrative. The sheer brutality of the murder, 41 strikes, cast doubt on her self-defense claim. The forensic evidence in Candy's account painted a chilling picture of a confrontation that escalated into unthinkable violence, leaving law enforcement to piece together the truth behind the horrifying act. The community, once united in faith, was now divided as the investigation unfolded, revealing the darkness that had lurked beneath Wiley's serene exterior. If you've made it this far into the story, type "picture" in the comments. Let's confuse everyone else who didn't. The trial of Candy Montgomery captured national attention, bringing the quiet town of Wiley under the media spotlight. In the courtroom, two opposing narratives clashed as the defense and prosecution presented their cases. Candy's defense portrayed her as a woman pushed beyond her limits. They argued that the confrontation with Betty triggered a dissociative state, a response to years of emotional strain and sudden fear. Psychiatric experts testified that Candy acted in self-defense during an uncontrollable reaction to Betty's attack with the axe. They painted the incident as a moment of primal survival, rather than a deliberate act of violence. The prosecution countered with the undeniable brutality of the crime. They emphasized the 41 strikes that killed Betty, arguing that such excessive force pointed to rage and intent, not self-defense. They questioned Candy's claim of fear, highlighting her calm demeanor after the murder and her methodical attempts to clean up the scene as evidence of calculated behavior. Forensic experts and witnesses added weight to both sides. Testimonies revealed inconsistencies in Candy's account and shed light on her composed behavior in the aftermath. The prosecution pressed on these points, urging the jury to consider the prolonged nature of the attack as evidence of something far more sinister than fear. The jury was left to decide between the psychiatric testimony and the horrific details of the crime. In the end, Candy was acquitted, a verdict that stunned the courtroom and divided public opinion. While the defense's strategy succeeded in creating doubt about her intent, the questions surrounding the case and Candy's actions left a community grappling with the limits of justice and morality. The Candy Montgomery case continues to haunt the collective memory of Texas and beyond, raising questions that remain unanswered. Was Candy a victim of unbearable fear and circumstance, acting out of primal survival? Or was she a calculating woman who used the justice system to escape accountability? The ambiguity of her actions leaves a chilling reminder of the complexities of human nature. The brutality of 41 axe strikes casts a long shadow over Candy's claims of self-defense, challenging the narrative of fear and survival. Yet, her image as a devoted wife and mother seemed incongruent with the horror of that day, dividing public opinion and fueling debates that linger to this day. This story also forces us to confront the cracks hidden beneath the polished facade of suburban life. It exposes the pressures of conformity, the isolation of domestic roles, and the devastating consequences of unspoken frustrations and buried secrets. Candy's actions and their aftermath remain a cautionary tale about how quickly the line between normalcy and tragedy can blur. As we close the book on this chilling case, one thing is certain. The story of Candy Montgomery is a stark reminder of the fragility of appearances and the dark truths that sometimes lie beneath. If this story has left you questioning human nature, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Join us again as we uncover more gripping true crime tales that delve into the hidden corners of humanity.